We are talking today about an application process, but depending on which tier you're targeting, whether it's tier 1 or tier 2, it's going to last either for the first half of 2020 or for kind of 3/4 of the year, depending which tier you go for. I want to begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all of the lands on which we live, work and learn, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and to recognise that we build on these ancient traditions of education and recognition and storytelling and culture, and that we do that in all kinds of ways, including by carrying on the higher education work that you're seeking to be recognised for in these awards processes. I want to begin, I'll give an overview of the webinar in a little while, but I want to dive straight in and invite you to think about your contribution. So you're here because you've either been nominated by somebody else or you have identified that you would like to take the career step of winning a tier 1 or a tier 2 teaching award for either an exemplary contribution or an outstanding contribution to student learning. So I want you to think about what that contribution is, and I appreciate that we are at the earliest moments of this process, and so you probably are not going to be thinking of the very refined version of your contribution, because that's going to take a while to get to. But just right now, when you think about what is it that you're doing that's award worthy, what would you like to be recognized for? And I'm going to invite you to communicate that contribution in one of 2 ways. If you are a visual kind of person, I'm going to invite you to very quickly create a billboard, and I'm going to give you a website that will help you do it, that has a brief message and an image that describes what it is that's exemplary or outstanding about your practice. Or if you're feeling more like a words person today, then I'm going to invite you to create a tweet. Tweets used to be 160 characters, but they've increased now to 280 characters, so you have a little more space to play with. We're going to spend 5 minutes on this, and so let me show you a couple of examples. The idea of it is just to crystallize where you're up to right now in terms of the thing that you'd like to be recognized for. Because, you know, winning a teaching award is not about being recognized for the depth and breadth of everything that you've ever done in your teaching practice. It's about pulling out a really particular kernel of contribution and drilling deep into that. So thinking about what that kernel might be, you're going to either make a tweet or make a billboard, as I've said. If you are choosing the tweet option, you might like to just jump into your Twitter account if you have one, and that way it will do the word counting for you, or the character counting, I should say. If you don't have Twitter, that's fine as well. You could use a website like wordcounter.net, or even I think Microsoft Word would do it for you, that will just count your characters as you type, because it's kind of impossible to eyeball what 280 characters would look like. You need a bit of tech help to count for you. If, on the other hand, you want to go the visual route, there is a link on the screen now that gives you just a very rudimentary billboard generator. It's going to invite you to upload an image, and it's going to invite you to type in some text. It doesn't give you a lot of text because billboards are all about being short and sweet. And then it will generate your words and your picture on a billboard, and you'll be able to save that as an image, as a reminder and an object of what it is that you're seeking to be recognized for at this point. So a couple of quick examples. This is the first approach. If you decide to do the tweet version, I just opened up wordcounter.net to count my characters for me. And so you're going to write the kernel of what it is that you are doing, and then some hashtags to describe the kind of keywords or the spirit of what it is you're talking about. So mine, pertinent to this workshop, turning award writing from a hefty chore to an impactful story. And then a string of hashtags, evidence writing, life-changing writing, etc. And if you need that link again, it's at the bottom of the page. Option 2 is the billboard. You'll see that it's a website that looks like it hasn't changed since maybe the 1990s, but it does the job. So when you go to this website, you're going to upload a picture. you're going to type in the text and then it's going to generate an image like the one that you're seeing on the top right-hand corner of the screen. So they are the two examples. If all of that feels a little overwhelming and like too many options, you're also welcome to be super low tech, grab a piece of paper or your keyboard and write a sentence or so that describes what you want to be recognized for. So that can be your plan C, depending what feels appealing right now. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do that. I'm going to leave you to it. I'll skip back just to the slide that gives you both of those links that you might need. I'm going to just mute my mic and my video for a minute so that you can concentrate. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. There are quite a lot of us on this call, which is fantastic. It means, unfortunately, that we're not going to have time to share everybody's billboard. However, I'm going to ask you to keep what you made and bring it with you to the next work that we have together. I would like us to use these as a jumping off point for discussing the nature of your contribution and the focus of your award. So make sure to keep them with you. For now though, we're going to focus on doing a pretty thorough but bird's eye level view of the crucial aspects of a successful teaching award application at the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 level. The tier that we are not discussing is Tier 3, which are the National Teaching Awards, Citations, University Teacher Awards and Program Awards. We're not talking about the Tier 3s today, but there is loads of information available about those, and there's a separate professional development program that focuses on those. So if this session gets you curious about stepping up onto the national stage, then there's definitely lots of support for you to do that. But our focus for today is squarely on the internal teaching awards here at CQU. So we're going to explore those by doing the following things. We're going to start out really continuing in the spirit of that initial activity that we did together of thinking about what are the award-worthy aspects of your teaching practice. You've had a very quick rapid-fire opportunity to think about your essence. What is the kernel? What's the central idea of what you do in your teaching practice? So we're going to talk about now making sure that that thing that you're seeking to be recognized for is indeed the most award-worthy aspect of your practice that you could focus on. Because sometimes the thing that that you think is the most award-worthy might not be. You might overlook a really particularly innovative aspect of your practice because to you, you've been doing it for ages and it just seems quite normal. But on reflection, you might realize that it is innovative, creative, recognized by others, and various other key markers of award worthiness, which we will talk about. We're going to do, and this is great because we have so many of you appropriately at this point undecided about whether you're going to pitch yourself for a Tier 1 or 2. We have about 50% of this group are undecided, another 50% or so are thinking Tier 1, and then just a small handful of you said that you were thinking of Tier 2. So we're going to talk about the two tiers and the choices around to them. We're going to talk about the assessment criteria, which are very similar across each of the two tiers. And we're going to talk about category choice, which is dissimilar across the two tiers. There are different categories that you will respond to and select from, depending whether you're going for a Tier 1 or a 2. We're going to talk about your contribution statement, your application narrative. We're going to start our conversation about evidence, but there's a lot more to say than what we will cover in this session. And then we'll wrap things up by talking about the timing of things throughout next year and the professional development and support program that exists to underpin your work in developing an outstanding application. And then, like I say, there is time at the end for questions and comments, but please do interweave them as we go along. So one of the most common criticisms of award assessors and award review panels, both at CQU but more broadly as well, is that assessors are concerned to receive applications where the teaching practice that's being discussed seems to be ordinary, routine, or just what you would expect of a person doing their job. This is one of the most recurrent criticisms that I've heard over, gosh, it's been about 15 years of working in this award development space. More than any other concern, this is the one, that people in their applications write about things that they just ought to be doing. And, you know, some examples of that would be things like responding to emails in a timely manner, or using a matrix to grade assignments according to a criteria-based matrix. Things like that, that yes, it's important that they be done, but unless something is done to distinguish them as exemplary or outstanding practice, panels and assessors are going to say, yeah, but shouldn't you be doing that anyway? Isn't that just you doing your job? So award success really means engaging in a process of framing your practice in such a way that you elevate it from something that's normal and routine that everybody would be anticipated to do to something that is, depending on the tier that you're going for, either exemplary, tier 1, or outstanding, tier 2. And there's various ways you can do that. A good application will do some combination of all of these things. So the first one is kind of thematic, and it's about focus. You want to make sure that when you're framing your award application, you focus in on the most outstanding aspects of practice. And probably in early drafts, you'll mention things that you eventually weed out as being not exemplary enough or not outstanding enough to merit inclusion. Because these award applications, they're pretty brief, as you know, they're 3 or 4 pages, depending on which tier you're going for. You don't have a lot of space, which means that what you do have, you want to be using it to really laser focus on the most outstanding aspects of what you do. You also want to verify the exemplary or outstanding nature of your practice. And one of the best ways to do that is have other people attesting to your work being either exemplary or outstanding, literally by quoting them in peer review or using some kind of proxy for people attesting to the quality of your work. For example, being published in a journal, being invited onto an advisory committee at your school level, institutional level, nationally, in industry, and so on. Having other people say the thing that this colleague does is exemplary is going to convince a panel more than you just telling us that it is. And then the next way to cure this ailment of things seeming ordinary is to benchmark and also to use superlatives to show that you're above and beyond the norm. So a classic example of this is that if you're using student evaluation data, what is normal within your discipline or your school is a really important thing to know, so that assessors can tell whether your number is something that is ordinary, well above or below ordinary.
Sorry to interrupt. Till, I've got a couple of questions for you on that.
Yeah, please.
You know, when we try to develop this laser focus, sometimes to sort of underpin the approach or the teaching style that we develop, we have to resort to literature. Mm-hmm. And I know that there's a 3-4 page limitations. So is using literature and references something that is allowed?
It is, and in fact, it's something that's required. You do it in a much more brief and summative way than you would if you were, let's say, writing a journal article about your practice. So you know how if you were writing a journal article, you would be sketching out the intellectual landscape in which you're working, you'd be referencing that back to key sources, and then you'd be describing how you have kind of climbed onto the shoulders of those giants and developed your practice. In an award application, you really use the literature to put up some signposts to say, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm drawing on the pertinent literature to inform my practice. And here are a couple of references, and I'm going to say 3 to 4 references in the application that show the assessors that you understand the intellectual context within which you're working. But whereas a single source might, in a journal article, get a paragraph or so of explanation and application to your context, in an award application, it will typically get a sentence, because you're nailing a sign into the ground to say, yep, my work is informed by this work, but you're not going all that much deeper than that.
And it's actually one of the assessment criteria, so you need to have it in there.
Oh, excellent. So this would mean that if you have published, say, any conference or journal papers, say on the method or the style that you've developed, then that should go in as well, and that will be seen as favorable.
Yeah, you don't want to be entirely self-referential. Make sure that you are referencing other sources than your own work. But yes, including your own. And depending which criterion you choose, and we'll get to that, which category you choose, and we'll get to that soon, you will be, if you're choosing a category that revolves around scholarship, then obviously you're going to be citing your own publications even more, because you want to prove the claim that you're making a scholarly contribution. But even if you're applying under a different category, your own publications, conference presentations definitely have a place.
Thank you. Thank you.
And strengthen it. Superlatives. We're going to wrap up this workshop with an exercise on superlatives. They're a really powerful way to signal to your reader that they should be impressed by the things that you have done. So superlatives are ways of saying, I'm better than others. So you might be the most effective, the most highly cited. Your students might be the quickest to gain employment. Those kinds of superlatives have an inbuilt point of comparison. And so as a reader, without needing to know the intricacies of your teaching context, the reader can be readily impressed that you've been the best, the most, the fastest, the first, the most efficient, the most highly acclaimed, any of those superlatives that amplify the impacts of what you have done. The next way to cure this risk of things being seen as ordinary or routine is to be really selective about the evidence you use and only select the very best of your best evidence. One of the challenges that I pretty much know for sure you're going to face is that you will have more to say than you have space to say it in your award application. And so one of the things you're going to want to do is strip out the evidence that is not your very, very highest quality. So an example that leaps to mind is that often in early drafts, people will include comments from students like, Maria was a really nice teacher. So unless your claim is about the emotional environment that you've built in your classroom and niceness is part of your central claim, you're going to want to strip out things that are fairly vague and broad like that, and instead use evidence that's really, again, laser focused on the particular thing that you are doing. Sometimes as well, if you're using evidence like thank you emails that students or colleagues might have sent you, there's often a lot of kind of social text built into those emails or cards or whatever they might be that doesn't need including. Phrases like thank you followed by a string of exclamation marks doesn't need to be cited. You can very appropriately truncate the words that you're extracting from that kind of evidence to really just use the best of the best. Again, the kernel of the idea. This is going to be a kind of catch cry for us as we move together as a group with your applications. What's the very central kernel of the idea? And that's the evidence that you want to keep in there. And then another way, and the final way to counteract this idea that what you're doing might just be routine expectations of a good educator, is to be contributing to the broader scholarship of learning and teaching community. So that goes to that earlier comment about being published, about speaking at conferences. You might have won a SALT grant at the institution. Anything like that is going to elevate your practice from ordinary or routine up to exemplary or outstanding, depending on the tier that you're going for. Having said that, everybody is going to be engaged in scholarship of learning and teaching. in order to win a tier 1 or tier 2. So if that's not your game, if that hasn't been your focus, you absolutely still can craft an award-winning application as long as you do a bunch of the other things in those dot points. So I want to show you an example. This is an imaginary paragraph out of a tier 2 application, and there are some things about it that are not that compelling. This is a paragraph that would definitely prompt an assessor to say, think they're trying to be recognised for some pretty ordinary expected practice. So let me give you a minute or so to read through that and see if you can identify in there something that needs fixing, so something that is a little too ordinary, and then maybe think about using those different approaches that we just talked about focus, about benchmarking, about evidence, and so on, something that might be done to fix it. I'll give you a few quiet minutes to do that. So let me invite somebody to jump in and identify an element of this that struck you as ordinary. Tell us something that you read in here that you thought, oh, that doesn't sound outstanding or exemplary, it just sounds pretty normal.
Is my mic working yet, Tilly?
Yes, perfectly.
Awesome, awesome. Well, reading through the majority of that, it's all quite ordinary and expected as part of any unit coordination until you hit the last sentence for me. And I think that's something that could have been the focus of the entire application and evidence-based, et cetera,
Absolutely. And the thing that's actually most remarkable, pretty deep in there. And that's why, and we'll talk about this at the end, we have lots of opportunities for drafting and draft reviews, so that when there are those treasures in an application that are really impressive but deeply buried, we can encourage you to consider rearranging them to give them more profile. Because this one really, most readers are going to be lost by the end because it's ho-hum and pretty plain until then. And then there's this quite remarkable thing about 400 students being connected individually to industry, but we're kind of lost by that point. So let's analyze this a little more. I've just done it in a quick color-coded way, and things that are required usual practice just shouldn't appear. So that first sentence, that there's always a thorough review of the unit outline, absolutely not worth including, because if you weren't doing that, there'd be something wrong. So including it doesn't serve any benefit. And then in the red, there are some concerning aspects of this paragraph. So phrases that are hedging, like students seem to appreciate, are going to make your assessors nervous, because how do you know? Are you just guessing that they probably would appreciate it, or do you have some firm evidence that they do? And if you have the firm evidence, then you want to weave that into the application. Maybe it's that you did an informal evaluation exercise in week 3 and you found out that yes, indeed, 90% of students appreciated the intervention, and you could maybe compare that to a unit in which that intervention wasn't offered and show that what you're doing is above and beyond. Another risk in award applications is that second red highlight, where applications are a little too self-referential. So in this one, this claim of, in my 25 years as a teacher, I know that students often get this thing wrong. Triangulate it with someone else's opinion or with the literature. This would be a great place to insert a citation from the literature to say, this is known to be an endemic problem in discipline X. However, I have responded to it in this effective way. The next one that you'll see highlighted in red there is that we've got this percentage, about 87% of students downloading, but we've got nothing to compare that to. Is that the most downloaded document? Is it double the rate at which other documents are downloaded? We need something that guides us about whether 87% is something to be ho-hum about or something to be impressed by. And then, like we were talking about just a minute ago, the highlighted in green part is actually the treasure in this example, but it gets no evidence and no explanation because it's just an afterthought at the very end. So I want to ask you just to jot very quickly down, is there something about your award application or your award concept, depending where you're at with your thinking, that runs the risk of being seen as ordinary practice? So try and step outside of your familiarity with your work for a minute. Play devil's advocate. Can you imagine anything that you might include that an assessor would say, oh, that sounds pretty ordinary? And if so, note it down, because that's going to need attention in your conceptualization of your award. And it's okay if at this point there isn't a risk. It might be that what you're doing is so innovative that it's going to be really obvious to people that it's an extraordinary practice. But if there is anything that arises for you, write it down. And then if you have written it down, you might like to think back to that list that we had of different ways to fix that problem, either through focus, verification, benchmarking, evidence, or scholarship. Is there a fix that you could apply in your application to offset that possibility? Because assessors, of course, only know as much as you tell them. They unfortunately can't get inside your classroom. They can't sit in on your labs. So all they've got are the words that you write in your application. What strategy might you use to head off a concern that what you're doing might just be you doing your job well? Now I want us to get into the differences between Tier 1 and Tier 2, particularly pertinent because so many of you are in the midst of deciding which one you might like to go for, or indeed, even if you are going to apply. Some of you are here, like I was saying before, because you've been nominated by your peers. Some are self-nominating. So wherever you're at in that decision-making process, I want you to have all the information in front of you to think about which tier will be yours in this next application round. So the next slide, I'm going to warn you, it's tremendously dense because I wanted to summarize for you all of the differences between Tier 1 and 2. I think I've broken every single rule of PowerPoint design, so I apologize in advance. But you will get a PDF copy of these slides afterwards. And so you can look at this at your leisure because I'm aware that there are a lot of words on the screen. But essentially what you're seeing is that everything that's bolded in either column is a point of difference. So there are some substantial overlaps between the two, and that's very intentional. The system for these teaching awards is that they build upon one another. And so rather than have you kind of reinvent the wheel of writing about your practice at every tier, we're seeking to offer you a process by which what you do in Tier 1 grows and feeds into what you produce for Tier 2. And then that echoes through to Tier 3, the National Teaching Awards as well. So just to talk through the differences between them, the first one is a timing. For a Tier 1, you would be submitting in around the middle of May 2020, and you would have 2 preliminary draft opportunities, which is where you send your draft in, you get detailed written feedback, and then you get a one-on-one conversation with me, where we work through that feedback and strategize how you would like to respond to it. For Tier 2, there's more time. The final drafts are due in late August of 2020, and there is an extra preliminary drafting round. There are 3 of them, drafting round. 3 of them, because Tier 2s are more complex. They're longer, they are outstanding rather than exemplary practice, so the bar is higher, and they're the next level up. So we give you an extra preliminary drafting round to support you to get ready. Most people, I think it's fair to say, most people do take advantage of all of those drafting rounds, but they are optional. So you might not choose to submit in all 2 or 3 of them, depending on which tier you're going for.
Can I just also mention that we're in the process of revising the procedure. So what we have here as the criteria may slightly change. It won't change that much, but there may be some aspects that will change, like the length of time that you need your evidence for, that sort of thing. So this is a good guideline, but it may slightly change before your application's due. and I'll keep you updated anyway.
Yes, absolutely. And the procedures are always the source of truth. So that's going to be your guide as you go along once those procedures are locked in place for next year. So the next one, which I think I've mentioned times already, is that Tier 1s are about rewarding and encouraging exemplary practice. And then the Tier 2s take that to the next level up and are about outstanding practice. The next point of difference is about timing. So if you're shooting for a Tier 1, the time period is slightly lower than if you're going for a Tier 2. It's no less than 3 terms spread over a minimum of 2 years. And then if you're going for a Tier 2, it's practice sustained for a period of no less than 3 years, or if you're an early career academic, within the first 5 years of your practice. Is that right, Marlene?
Yes.
Then 2 years becomes the number, so no less than 2 years if you're in your first 5 years of academic work.
And that includes any tutoring, that sort of thing, and it doesn't have to be a consecutive.
Can it be at other universities?
Yes, within 5 years of you starting your academic career, if you're still within that 5 years, that's an early career. But if you're outside of that 5 years, so if you've been practicing for more than 5, then you're not classified as early career.
My question related to the applications and the time requirements, like a minimum of 2 years for Tier 1.
And are you asking whether that has to have happened at CQ Uni?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, it does, because these are awards that recognise your outstanding contributions at the institutional level. But you might like to mention that you have been doing it for even longer, factoring in things that you've done before. And indeed, when you jump to Tier 3, you would be weaving in previous employment if you've come from somewhere other than CQU. But for this purpose, it's important that your practice has happened at CQU for those time periods that you're seeing on screen.
So you have to be here for 2 years before you can apply?
Yes.
So what has to happen? This has to be outstanding practice that benefits CQU students. So if you've got some of the time at another institution and you can say that you developed that, whatever it was at that other institution, then you brought that same thing to CQU, and our students have benefited from that for basically the majority of that time, then we shall allow it. They're quite difficult to write, these ones, where you have to be able to show that you've taken practice from somewhere else and you brought it in to benefit CQU students. So it can be done, but there's probably only been one previously successful one that I've seen.
So then the next thing is the package that you submit for your application. Very similar for Tiers 1 and 2. There's just a couple of differences in terms of quantity and terminology. So if you're going for a Tier 1, the 25-word statement that you write about your practice is called an exemplary practice summary. This comes from, if you're familiar with the National Teaching Awards that we've had in Australia for, gosh, I think maybe 13 or so years, built around this 25-word same thing. Yeah, so if you're going for a Tier 1, you're going to be writing your 25-word statement, and when we talk about it, it's going to be called an exemplary practice summary. If you're a Tier 2, you're also going to be crafting that all-important 25-word statement. It's going to be called an outstanding contribution summary, really just to remind you and us of the different standards of quality, I guess, between Tier 1 and Tier 2, the distinction between exemplary and outstanding. The structure of your application is very much the same, except that for a Tier 1, you're squeezing everything into 3 pages. And for a Tier 2, because the standard that you're seeking to demonstrate is higher, you've got an extra page to do that with. And for a tier 1, you're providing 1 letter of support. For a tier 2, you're providing 2 of them. And we had a question in the chat about who writes those letters of support. It is the Deputy Dean Learning and Teaching for the applicant or for the team who is applying, or whatever the equivalent position would be if you're in a non-school role in a different kind of work area. So that's what the 1 letter has to be. And then the tier 2, you have latitude to decide where your 2nd letter of support will come from. And people make different choices depending on the contribution that they're seeking to be recognised for. If it's a claim that relates to deep connections with industry, for example, then you might have a letter of support from a Chamber of Commerce or a professional organisation. If you're making a claim about alumni engagement, you might have a letter of support from a collection of graduates who write you a letter together. If you're writing about scholarship of learning and teaching, you might have a journal editor or a conference convener write that 2nd letter. You might have a colleague from down the corridor who can attest really powerfully to your practice because they see it on a regular basis. You've got much more freedom about what that 2nd letter is if you are going for a tier 2. The next point is about evidence. There is a model that we use pretty extensively called the 4Q model, and we're going to come to this at the end, so it will make more sense in a little while. Essentially, for a tier 1, we ask you to draw evidence from at least 2 quadrants of that model, making sure that 1 of them is centered on students. And then for a tier 2, you're going to be drawing on all 4 of the 4Q quadrants. For a tier 3 application, some of that would need to be external to CQU, but for a tier 2, it's very appropriate that all of your evidence comes from within the institution. It doesn't have to, but there's no expectation that you would be going beyond CQU. That one may be sounding very unfamiliar to you if you haven't encountered the 4Q model yet, so we'll return to it in a couple of minutes when we get to there. The next one is the categories that you're responding to. So they are different in tier 1 and tier 2, and I'm going to give you a couple of grids in a moment that compare the 2 of them. And then the criteria for which you're, against which you're assessed, very similar, except for that one difference that broader community might weave into your tier 2 and is not required in your tier 1. There is a difference, obviously, in the amount of money that you win. It's $1,000 for a tier 1, $5,000 for a tier 2, and winning a tier 2 makes you eligible for a national award application. There was a question in the chat about whether you have to be sequential. Do you have to get a tier 1 before a tier 2? And the answer to that is no. You are, like Nadine has said in the chat, you can jump straight into a tier 2, or you can move through them sequentially, whichever works best for you. And we had another question about whether you can apply as a team, and you absolutely can. You actually, you submit 1 extra piece of documentation, which is a description of each of your team members' contributions, and you absolutely can apply that way. This is something that I'm going to invite you to do outside of the workshop. These are some prompt questions to think about which tier is for you. And this is going to take some reflecting, so I don't want to rush you through it. But think about things like, for how long have you been doing the thing that you're seeking to be recognised for? Which of the standards, exemplary or outstanding, seems to best reflect what you're doing? Also think about how your work can be segmented. Is there a piece of it that you could carve off and profile in the tier 1, and then segue into a tier 2 that recognises another aspect of your practice, and then have a really strong basis of recognition to apply for your tier 3. And then there might also be a pragmatic question depending on what 2020 looks like for you. Are those submission dates feasible in terms of submitting early or later in the year? That might help you make a decision too. You can also win a tier 2 and then you can at another point in time apply for a tier 1, is that correct?
Yes, there are time limits though, so you have to reapply outside of those time limits, but it's all in the procedure.
Yes, it's all in there. My kind of overarching advice would be that to make yourself nationally competitive, the more recognition you've received, the better. So I'd be encouraging you to seek both a Tier 1 and a Tier 2. That would be my advice, but it's going to differ each time, and you can have conversations with Marlene and Nadine about it as well, to decide just what approach you would like to take in terms of choosing your tier. So more on that, the tiers have different application categories, and we're not going to go through these in detail, but I'm just including them here as a reference guide for you. The procedures also, and as Marlene was saying, they are being updated. They will be your source of truth about what the categories are.
Tilly, can I just clarify something about the letters of support?
Please.
Regardless of whether you're applying for a Tier 1 or Tier 2, you need a letter of support from your dean. So Tier 1, that's all you need, just the letter of support from your dean. And when you get to Tier 2, you need a letter of support from your dean. And the extra one, try to choose someone that knows your practice and is a little bit influential.
Yeah, so the core requirement is a dean letter, and then for a Tier 2, you've got a second voice as well. Okay, so the categories. Tier 1 has these 4 categories. The first one is around designing and delivering teaching for learning. The second one, the defining feature of it, is the ways in which your students are encouraged and supported. The third category is defined by how you use evaluation in order to improve your practice. And the fourth one is about ways that you enrich your learning and teaching by integrating other features into it, such as discipline-based research, scholarship of learning and teaching, etc. And so as you're making your decision around which tier and which category, I'd encourage you to use this grid, but also the procedures document to be thinking about where does your work best sit. Often it could sit in more than one, and it's not unusual for people to change their mind throughout the drafting process. Completely normal to do that. So that is there for your reference. In Tier 2, again, there are 4 categories, but they are different from Tier 1. The defining features are listed there. The first one is about students being inspired by what you do. The second one, in its very essence, is about making outstanding resources or curricula for students. The third is about change resulting from how you evaluate your practice. And the fourth one is about your practice being amplified in some way to a larger scale, often through leadership or scholarship. So they are there for your reference. And again, something to sit with outside of this workshop is where you're sitting in terms of your category choice. If you're familiar with these awards, or if you've had a Tier 1 already, you might have a category in mind. Or if you're brand new to this might be the first time that you're thinking about where your work sits. So I'd encourage you to do some reflecting on that. The criteria, like I was saying, are pretty similar across the 2 levels. In this one, what you're seeing in bold type is just the key idea of each criterion, and they only differ in terms of E and F, slightly different requirements around recognition and sustained, as we have talked about already. And yeah, just a flag to say reading the procedures is your source of truth for these, because what I've done just for the purposes of the slides is do some abbreviating. So you want to make sure that you're reading the criteria in full so that you're really familiar with them. Another reflective exercise that you might like to do, maybe not quite yet, but at some point in the next month or so, would be to think about those criteria and then rate yourself from a 1 to 5 of how competitive you think you are. Later on in the process, we'll do this same exercise in terms of how ready do you think you are across meeting all of these criteria. But for now, you know, just thinking kind of globally about what you have at your, you know, what you have available to you, how competitive do you reckon you are in terms of the focus of your application, the evidence, the impact, and so on. So that's a point there for reflection. I want to just run quickly through a couple of examples of statements. This is from Katrina Johnson, a Tier 1 winner of last year. And so the reason I'm sharing these is that I want to show you how much can get packed into a single statement, and how important it is that your application narrative, the body of the application, that it delivers on the promise of everything that is included here. So Katrina was recognised with a Tier 1 for creating a stimulating and safe learning environment using adult learning principles and innovative visual resources to empower students to better navigate digital technologies. So this is a series of promises that I've fleshed out there in the dot points that her application would have had to prove or justify. So there would have been evidence and narrative around each one of those dot points. And the statement, the exemplary practice summary or the outstanding practice summary, it is a roadmap essentially that guides your application into what it needs to describe and what it needs to evidence throughout the 3 or the 4 pages, depending what level you are going for. Here's another example. This one is in finance. Tassaduk won a Tier 2 last year. And so you'll see again in the dot points all of the beats that his application needs to hit. It's going to need to evidence and narrate success and satisfaction, not just one or the other, because they're quite different things. It's going to have to speak to his claim about cognitive difficulty. It will talk about this learning taking place in the finance discipline. It will justify his claims about being both exceptional and outstanding, mirroring the language of the Tier 2 requirements in terms of outstandingness. And then it will talk about engaged teaching and unit leadership. So a lot of promises packed in there. The other test, here's another one just to show you, and in the slides that you'll get for reference, you'll see that unpacked as well. Another really key test is that you want to write a statement that could not be written about anybody else. You want it to tell a story that is uniquely yours. So Joe Luck and also Betul Sekendes both won Tier 1 and 2 awards in 2018, High Achievers. And so I thought it was useful just to side by side one of those, Joe's 2 summary statements, to kind of illustrate the differences between a Tier 1 and a Tier 2. Pretty similar wording, but what you're seeing in Tier 2 is this ramping up in the claim that's being made. A stronger reminder about Joe creating a learning environment. It's a stronger claim than just saying it's a collaborative environment. This language that says support and guide was the words that she used in her Tier 1, reflective of the wording that's in the procedures document. In Tier 2, she talked about preparing a diverse range of students. And then in Tier 1, her kind of standard was about students writing their COC submissions. But then in Tier 2, she wanted to be more superlative and more kind of robust in her language. So she talked about student success. And so looking at those 2 side by side kind of reminds us of the differences between a 1 and a 2. So for you later on, think about what key features you'd like your statement to highlight. The next thing I want to just flag with you, we're not going to go through this in any detail this time, but I will say that it's available on StaffNet in the LTS section in a better quality than it's going to show up on the slides that you get a copy of. The 4Q model essentially says evidence of good teaching practice comes from all kinds of places. In the first quadrant, it comes from the reflection that we all do about our own teaching practice. It also comes from different measures of student learning. quadrant 2. It also comes from what other people say about us, peer and third-party interactions, that's quadrant 3. And lastly, it comes from student experience and items that evidence student experience. So you'll remember that we were saying before that for a tier 1, you're only expected to address 2 quadrants of here, but it's really important that one of those be a student-centric quadrant, which means either Q2 or Q4. And then you can take your pick of either self-reflection or peer. Don't feel like you have to be limited to that. You can be across all 4 if you like, but remember, you've got less space to do it in. And so you might like to just be a little more targeted to buy yourself some more space.
Just, sorry, Tilly, did you say, just so I'm clear, for tier 1, you only need to address, was it 2 of the, or 1 of the quadrants, but they have to be student-centric? Is that what you said?
You have to address 2 of them, and
2.
One of the 2 needs to be student-centric.
Okay, right.
Yeah. So essentially we're saying 1 from the left-hand side, 1 from the right.
Yep.
At least. We've got a question from Jay about whether photographic evidence is acceptable. Yeah, it is. Captioning photographs is really important. Just dropping photos in without an explanation of what the reader should make of them is a bit of a risk in applications, but you can absolutely include well-captioned photographs. They break things up visually. People tend to respond pretty well to them. How many is too many? I'd say 2 or 3 would be your maximum. And in that, I'm talking photos and other visual materials. So if you've got a chart that shows student feedback scores, that would count in your 2 or 3. And so not too many of them, but enough to break it up and to kind of bring your reader into your classroom as well. And also making sure that it's interwoven in the body of the application so that you guide your reader right to that photograph and to the caption that you, of course, would include. A couple of points about the use of evidence. Just here, we're going to go into these in much more depth, so I will leave that there for now. Another thing that I would encourage you to do as you reflect on this workshop and make your plans for how you'd like to proceed in the awards for 2020 is to think about what evidence you have for your contribution being insert your choice of superlative here. Were you the best, the first, the fastest, the highest, the best regarded, and what evidence would you have for that being the case? So that's an activity that you might like to do in preparation for our time together in December. Which brings us then to what happens between now and submission. So in mid-December, we are convening in Brisbane on these dates. If you are applying for a tier 1, we invite you to be there on the 10th and the 11th of December. If you're applying for a tier 2 and you are brand new to CQU Teaching Awards, we invite you to be there from the 10th to the 12th. If you're applying for a tier 2 and you've already had a tier 1, then we invite you to join us from the 11th to the 12th. We're doing a kind of rolling workshop where the tier groups get some time on their own with us and then some time with their adjacent tier so that the 2s can learn from the 3s and the 1s from the 2s and so on. So they are the dates for Brisbane. There are webinars right through the application process. This one, and then for tier 1, there's February, March and April webinars where we talk about narrative, evidence, editing, writing effectively and so on. And similar topics but spread out across different dates to reflect the timing. For tier 2, they're in February, May and August. We're also doing in March for tier 1s and April for tier 2s, an online group check-in, an informal Zoom meeting where I will give some kind of global reflections on what's been emerging in drafting rounds, how everybody's tracking, obviously in an appropriately de-identified way, but just to give you a sense of what's emerging from the development process and a chance for you to talk to each other and to us about your application development. And then draft reviews and the one-on-ones that I mentioned happen for tier ones in February and in March. It takes a while. You submit and then they go out for reading and then they come back to you and we have our one-on-ones. So I think for tier twos, it's actually kind of like February/March and then March/April, because it spans across a couple of months. And for tiers, it's happening in March, June and August. There are online support materials on StaffNet, lots of downloadable things there, and also previous year's workshops that you can dip into and watch. You have Marlene as the source of all things procedural and process related, and also just incredibly experienced in this, and Nadine as the panel chair to call upon, and then submissions like we talked about mid-May for tier ones and early September for tier twos. And we'll be sending more details out in terms of dates, and you'll also have this slide for reference when I send the slides out to you, or when Marlene sends the slides out to you, I should say.
I've got a quick question. So the submission is in mid-May, right? If this new thing that I've implemented, I've only implemented it in term 1 2019, I've run it in term 2 2019, and I plan to run it again term 1 2020. Is that considered will that be considered 3 terms, or would I be looking at applying for this award the following year?
Will you have data from that term 1 2020?
So it will be probably initial data from that last term, but I will have data from term 1 and term 2 for 2019.
Yeah, we can workshop it more together in December, but as long as you had some evidence emerging from the third term's implementation, I think you would be safe. If you only had evidence from those first 2, then it's not going to fit the requirement. Preparing for Bristol, 3 dot points that tell us what you think you're going to apply to be recognised for, and a description of the time for which your contribution has been sustained, just naming which terms and which years is enough in that regard. And then also we're going to ask you to bring all your working documents with you. Any evidence that you've got electronically, bring it with you. Any existing documentation, any drafts. If you've written promotion applications that you could recycle words from, bring those. If you're going for a tier 2, make sure you bring your tier 1 materials, because you can probably reshape and use some of those. And because we're doing a couple of solid days of what I like to think of as a kind of writing boot camp, also bring things that make you comfortable. Favorite kinds of tea, comfortable shoes, pens that you like to write with, a keyboard or a mouse if that's easier for you than being purely on a laptop for the couple of days. Anything that helps you. It's a very hands-on, practical workshop where you get a whole lot of time to get your work done. So bring things that make it as effective a working environment as you can. So before we jump into Q&A, just to summarize, we've talked about 4 broad areas today. We've talked about writing an application that is distinctively about you. We've talked about the decision between tier 1 and tier 2 and some of the factors to take into account. We've started to touch on crafting your application and the things that build into that. And then you've had a bit of a forecasting of the awards development timeline and the PD program that's offered to you to support you in writing an excellent application.
Could I just, this might be a silly question, so I apologise in advance.
There's never a silly question.
Is there a, I know that the expressions of interest are due on by the 13th. Is there I haven't had a detailed look into it, but is there a specific format for any of those, or is it just sort of touching on your sort of summarising your practice or anything like that? If someone couldn't help me out.
You don't even really need to do that, Lincoln. You just need to send me an email and say, yes, I'm definitely going forward. But
okay, right.
Yeah, I assume that you're going to. So I've put you in there anyway.
No worries. Thank you.
Marlene does a lot of mind reading, but some things she just doesn't quite get. So it's probably a good idea to send her emails and let her know what you're doing.
Yes, true. Because if you've come to the workshop today and now decided that you don't want to proceed for 2020, let me know, because I've got you as a list of people who've attended. So, and that you're planning to apply for whichever tier you said you were going to apply for. So if you've decided since then that you're probably going to leave it for a year, then let me know so that don't waste your time.
We've got a minute or so left. I'm aware that people are having to leave. It's been great to have you on this call and very excited to be working together for the 2020 round. It's going to be a lot of work, but I hope it will also be an opportunity for you to be recognized and to really reflect on your practice and the power of what you do to improve student learning. People who go through this process find it a pretty even mix of maybe one of the most difficult things they've ever done and also the most liberating. So I hope that it's the same for you as you travel through the process. CQ Uni provides loads of support, so you're really well placed to be supported and guided through this process and to be appropriately recognized for the fantastic work that each of you does. I'm excited to learn more and more about the particulars of that. And so I thank you so much for participating. Thank you all so much.
Any questions that you have that you think of after the workshop, just send them along to LT Grants-Awards at CQU and they'll be answered